Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
And the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, release stories, distribution stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, throughout all the difficulties, films somehow get made. I'm going to take you to 1987, the film No Way Out, and I'm going to set things up with a clip from the film. Story comes the other side of this.
They needed a hero.
I understand he has a background in intelligence.
There's 2 tours with naval intelligence.
Get him here.
He liked excitement.
Take us somewhere.
He wanted her. Their passion upset the balance of power.
What's all this top secret business I've been hearing about over the Pentagon?
You know I work for Bryce?
Then that makes 2 of us.
This one can do things for me like no other woman I've ever met.
Behind the cover-up,
Try and understand.
the power.
The important thing is to abort an investigation before it ever gets to you.
You haven't told me everything.
Who's running this thing at the Pentagon?
The new boy, Farrell.
So we can take the fall in case anything goes wrong.
The loyalty.
I love you. I promise I'll work everything out.
How did you actually meet the Secretary of Defense?
I need a car. It's an emergency.
These people have already tried to kill one person who knew.
Bring this one down. No, you can't take that.
Behind the deceit.
If it were your intention to bring down David Bryce, then I'd have no choice but to make sure that you didn't get away with it.
They mean to kill me, Sam.
Because of the truth, there's no way out. Kevin Costner, Gene Hackman, Sean Young, Will Patton, No Way Out.
The film's directed by Roger Donaldson with a screenplay by Robert Garland based on the novel The Big Clock by Kenneth Fearing, coming back to that shortly, and a cast starring Kevin Costner, Gene Hackman, Sean Young, Will Patton and Howard Duff. So to tell the story of the making of the film, let's go right the way back then to 1946, because that's when that book, The Big Clock by Kenneth Fearing, was first published. A novel, it's a thriller that's got a bit of a Rashomon flavour to it, a story told from lots of different perspectives. In the case of the book, each of its chapters forms the perspective of a different character. And it's also a book that didn't take long to get to the movies at all. In fact, within a couple of years, there was a 1948 film starring Ray Milland, Charles Laughton and Rita Johnson. The book was adapted again too in 1976 in France, this time as the film Police Python 357 from Alain Corneau. And the idea of another English language take on the material first came up in around 1977, a good decade before we saw the completed movie. This was the idea of a company called B&B Associates. Now, B&B Associates was primarily a talent agency, but a talent agency looking to move into film production. And so it picked up a script by Robert Garland. Garland had adapted The Big Clock from Kenneth Fearing's original pen. But what Garland had done was he took this book and he reset it entirely, this time into the world of military intelligence. He moved the story to Washington, D.C. as well, to the heart of American government, completed that script, and he called it Finished with Engines. The final film would not be called Finished with Engines, but at that point, that was the name of the project. And so it was also the name of the project that B&B picked up, and it was looking to move fast. This plan to move into film production, well, it wasn't looking to mess around at all. The idea was, let's get finished with engines before the cameras in 1978, presumably then with a 1979 release in mind. I mean, the 70s were hardly shy of political thrillers, and they were making good money at that point as well. So it made sense to push it with reasonable speed. But the problem here was that the project didn't necessarily die, but it went through, over time, lots and lots of different studios and different producers, because B&B's plan was halted fairly quickly. Finished with engines went into what's known as turnaround, and it stuck into development hell for a while. There were people consistently interested in the script that Robert Garland had written. What there wasn't was ever a yes. Lots of people were turning it down. In fact, the story goes that over the course of 9 years, 6 different movie studios turned the film down. 3 television networks also turned the film down. And as Kevin Costner would remark in an interview around the time of the movie's release, No Way Out just wasn't going to be made by anybody. Now, the catalyst was Costner in this case, and Costner just relayed the story of how Orion Pictures wanted to make a picture with me, and I wouldn't make anything they had at that point. But he'd read this script, and he said, I thought it was kind of interesting. He said it didn't smack of a mega hit, but it did remind me of why I like movies. Orion read it and said, okay. And so Costner was on board at that point. Orion agreed to fund and pick up the project. In came a producer by the name of Laura Ziskin, the late Laura Ziskin. And at the point that they were moving with the film, they got it set up at a studio. Costner was agreeing to take on the lead role, and Ziskin was going to produce. They approached a director, and Roger Donaldson was fairly soon top of the list. Now, Donaldson, at this point in his career, had come over from his native New Zealand. He was riding high off the back of his hit Smash Palace, which had firmly opened the door to him in Hollywood. Donaldson was also enjoying working in Hollywood, and Orion Pictures, at this point headed up by a man called Mike Medavoy, was seen as a filmmaker-friendly studio as well. So Donaldson took a look at the script and really liked the script as well. He certainly saw something in it. And I mean, by the end of all of this, Donaldson would say it was the best experience with a studio he'd ever have. And he went on to do all sorts of films across his career. I mean, by this stage, he'd also done The Bounty in Hollywood as well. He would go on to do movies such as Cocktail, Dante's Peak, 13 Days, The Recruit, The Bank Job. But this was the experience with a studio that he would enjoy the most. So it was then a case of casting the other key roles. And to play opposite Costner, I mean, they knew they needed an experienced actor with some gravitas. I mean, Costner fairly early in his career here, remember, as well. And an offer went to Gene Hackman. Now, Gene Hackman at this stage was, I mean, he'd had ups and downs throughout his career, but he was known to, particularly to those who really loved their movies off the back of films like The French Connection. And so the offer went into him, and Hackman was fairly quickly interested in the project. Donaldson and his team still had to go and pitch it to him and had to convince Hackman that there was a role in there. And eventually Hackman did agree to sign on the dotted line. For the female lead, well, Sean Young was, this was a case of an audition that sort of went wrong, but also sort of went right. Because she arrived for her audition for the role, the crucial role of Susan Atwell, not entirely prepared in the traditional sense, because she turned up and stood in front of Roger Donaldson and the team and just admitted that she hadn't learnt the lines she was supposed to be learning for the audition. And ordinarily, that's a complete deal breaker. It's just like the audition's over, everybody up, let's go home. But what Sean Young had done, and not for the last time in her career, was she went left field to try and get a role, because instead of having all of the lines and instead of being able to recite them as required, she walked into the audition having written part of a diary that she felt her character would have written. And Donaldson was really interested in that. Interested enough, certainly, to ask her to come back again once she'd learnt the lines, which she did. She turned up with lines learnt, and she duly landed the role. Now, it's also worth noting that all sorts of auditions took place to fill out supporting parts in this. I wasn't aware for a very long time that Brad Pitt is apparently an uncredited party guest in No Way Out. I can't spot him, but I'm told by the internet, so it's bound to be true. But take a look at David Paymer, for instance, who will go on to earn an Oscar nomination for his supporting role in the film Mr. Saturday Night. He auditioned for the film and got through as well. Likewise, you see actors fairly early in their career. I mean, Will Patton lands a role. Iman also takes on a part in the film. And then Fred Dalton Thompson, who then would turn up commanding an airport, if memory serves, in Die Hard 2. I mean, he was a suggestion of Roger Donaldson as he fleshed together what he felt was a very complete cast. The screenplay remained titled Finished with Engines for quite a while, and as Donaldson said, everybody said you've got to have a better title than that or it'll never go anywhere. And there was quite a bit of confusion as to just what that original title would mean. However, it changed. It would change to something far simpler and far, in the end, more memorable. And so on April the 7th, 1986, in Los Angeles originally, filming would begin on No Way Out. But it wasn't called No Way Out at that point. As filming was getting underway, the movie had now changed its title to Deceit. Still, on it went, and the trickiest part of the shoot was one of the very, very, very early things we see in the film. The opening sequence where we see a flyover of Washington DC, where we get close up with the architecture of government buildings, and just imagine in the modern era someone being able to fly a plane as close to those buildings as they get in the opening of No Way Out and be able to present them for real, shot by a plane, getting that close. Now, were a filmmaker trying to do it, they'd look to do it with a drone, and good luck to anyone who applies to the American government to fly a drone that close to government buildings. It's a really, really impressive opening shot, and it was, I mean, Roger Donaldson would talk about how the pilot was absolutely fearless, and it got to a point where they were shooting all of that where air traffic controllers were suggesting that they just simply shouldn't be flying quite that low, that it was starting to present some kind of danger. Remarkably as well, the film was able to get some shots in the government buildings themselves, notably the Pentagon. And it would be fair to say this has not proven to be a common occurrence. I can't think off the top of my head of any other film that got the level of permission that this did. But they did, and it added to the authenticity of the kind of corridors of power feeling that Roger Donaldson and his team were going for. Now, the film was shot by John Olcott, the cinematographer who'd worked with Stanley Kubrick on films such as 2001: A Space Odyssey. And as Donaldson explained, he had the idea of shooting it basically in Super 35. And he said that was to extend the gate of the camera where the soundtrack would normally go on the film, and therefore expose more of the film stock, with the argument being you get a much bigger and much sharper image as a result of that. And that's the way that they shot the film. They just tried to throw us just a little bit off kilter with the visual look of it. When it actually came to the filming as well, Hackman and Costner both got on well, and Costner at this stage was upcoming. Hackman had come up through the system, had been chewed up a bit by it as well, and of course had put in some spectacular performances on screen, but he was very much the established star. And there is a story that Costner tells about how Hackman was impressed at how much Costner was willing to fight for what he wanted and what he thought his character should do. It was also Costner who was insistent. He was doing as much of his own stunt work too, where he could. That doesn't tend to go down well with the people who cover the insurance on film productions. But this was Costner again, a youngish actor at this point, and felt a lot more able and wanted, again, that feeling of authenticity that the actor is in the middle of the shot. Now, some of the production, as much as this was an American film, did actually take place in Donaldson's native New Zealand. There is a sequence fairly early in the film where we see Costner's character active in the Navy and in a rescue in the Navy, and that was shot down in New Zealand. Donaldson was able to take a small crew there to film those particular moments in the movie. And then also, one notable thing, throughout the shoot of this, Roger Donaldson had absolutely no idea that actually what he was filming was a remake. He had no idea and no foreknowledge of what had gone before here. And the moment the penny dropped was when he was at a party and he met Mel Gibson. Now, he knew Mel Gibson, he'd worked with him on The Bounty, and it was Gibson who just said something along the lines of, I hear you're working on a remake of The Big Clock. And Donaldson was completely nonplussed by this. Just like, no, I'm not. I'm making this government thriller. It was Gibson who ultimately corrected him. Now, not wishing to spoil the ending of the film, but this being shot in the 1980s, released in the 1980s before the pesky internet came along, well, it meant that the secrets could be kept very much undercover. And I mean, it's hard to talk about the denouement of the movie without giving too much away. But what's interesting, talking to Donaldson about it, is that the ending was never under threat. There was never a sense that it was going to be changed at all. This is what they committed to. This was a very, very bold step to take. And I mean, it was never put before a test audience who said change it or anything like that. From start to finish, that was how the film was going to end up. A real surprise, really. The movie went into post-production, and again, a fairly steady edit on this, but one of the things that came up was they knew they wanted a song for the film. They had to find a title that worked, and by this stage, Orion was gravitating towards No Way Out. I think that's a good title. Why don't they go with that? And also, there was this thinking that you want a tie-in song. Because after all, look at An Officer and a Gentleman that had come out a few years before. The title song from that, Love Lift Us Up Where We Belong, had been an enormous smash. And this created A, an extra revenue stream, and B, a whole lot more publicity for the film. And so they knew in the midst of this, they wanted a song. So even film historians might look back on the films of the 80s and the film songs of the 80s and not particularly appreciate that there is a big song in the midst of it all. But Paul Anka was hired to do a title song, which is what plays through fruitier moments of the movie. There was a tragedy in post-production as John Alcott went away on holiday once the film had wrapped up, and he went to France and suffered a fatal heart attack, and the film is dedicated to him. The final cut of the film, meanwhile, well, that was readied happily in time, well in advance, actually, of the film's ultimate August the 14th, 1987 release date. It had cost about $15 million to realise at this point. But what Orion Pictures wanted to do was hedge its bets a little bit, because it was aware it potentially had a huge movie, well, certainly an upcoming movie star, potentially a huge movie star in its ranks. And so Kevin Costner had shot another movie by this point. He'd shot it with Brian De Palma, the film The Untouchables. And The Untouchables was a Paramount Pictures production, a more traditional big movie studio. And Paramount Pictures' marketing budget was a lot bigger than Orion could afford to stump up. And so Orion made a bit of a tactical decision here, that it decided to delay No Way Out's release, wagering that The Untouchables was going to be a massive hit. Certainly that was the chatter in Hollywood at that point, and The Untouchables did indeed prove to be a massive hit. What this meant was that Orion could ride on the coattails, really, of the success of The Untouchables. Kevin Costner's profile would be up enormously off the back of The Untouchables becoming a box office success, and also a critically acclaimed film too, The Untouchables being the film that won Sean Connery's Oscar, of course. And so the release was put back several weeks just to accommodate this tactical decision. And in the Los Angeles Times, as Costner observed, he said it's a business and they have to make the movies they think are right and correct. The important thing is that they release it. Well, they did release it, and Orion put it in front of critics, and the response to the film was really strong. Really strong. The fact that Donaldson, first of all, absolutely knew his way around a suspense thriller, that came up in the reviews that we saw. Touch points of classic thrillers of the 40s and 50s as well. But also the fact that you had this film with effectively three big lead roles and three really well played lead roles too. Kevin Costner's performance was singled out as the one that would take him from an up-and-coming actor to a movie star, which sort of happened. I think there was a bunch of films that was happening there. I think what ultimately got him over the line was 1990's Dances with Wolves, the film that he would go off and direct. The bottom line, though, was that No Way Out was getting really, really good reviews, and people were protecting the secrets of the film as well. That absolutely would not happen now. And so Orion could confidently put it into cinemas, hoping that it would get its $15 million back. And so on that weekend of August the 14th to the 16th, off it went to US cinemas. Now, there was competition about. I mean, August release dates in the 1980s were tended to be where you left more off-peak stuff. But still, Disney had released Stakeout the week before, and that was topping the charts. There was a James Bond film that was 3 weeks into release, The Living Daylights, the 007 debut of Timothy Dalton. That was soaking up a bit of money as well. In terms of absolute flat-out massive blockbuster hits, though, there weren't that many around. The competition was busy, but nothing was dominating. You had films such as RoboCop that was 5 weeks into release and able to soak up a bit of money. The biggest release opposite No Way Out was a Disney picture called Don't Buy Me Love, which had Patrick Dempsey and Amanda Peterson in the lead roles. Actually, that would go on, as much as it's not really talked about at all now, that would go on to do a reasonable amount of business, that particular movie. But then crucially, so would No Way Out. And No Way Out opened in 4th place at the American box office. It was playing on 806 screens, so one of the lowest totals in the top 10. Helped itself to $4.2 million, and Orion was A, really happy with the reviews it was getting, but B, the box office performance of it was pretty decent as well, not least when it stayed in the top 5 the following week as movies such as Born in East LA and a little film called Dirty Dancing burst into the top 5 on their opening weekends. The surprise, though, was after 3 weeks when No Way Out's word of mouth was really catching on, and it suddenly jumped up to 2nd place. That Stakeout was still at the top of the chart. Dirty Dancing was getting word of mouth as well. But even as movies such as The Fourth Protocol and Hamburger Hill and House 2, the second story, were offering it some competition, No Way Out was able to soak up a fair amount of business, and it would hang around in the American charts for quite a while as well. In all, it played for around 20 weeks, amassing a box office total in America of $35 million, at a point where $35 million is a nice amount of money, thank you very much. This film too also had an unexpected knock-on effect, because unbeknownst to the creatives of No Way Out, well, apart from one of them, there was another Kevin Costner film that was potentially being set up at Orion that it could make, a film called Bull Durham. And Orion had given itself, it had a deadline really of 24 hours to decide whether it wanted to fund Bull Durham before Kevin Costner would go off and do another baseball movie for another studio. It was the opening of No Way Out that convinced Orion to gamble on that project, in spite of the fact it had 2 or 3 other baseball movies it had in various stages of development. But had No Way Out not hit, then we wouldn't have got Bull Durham, because Orion was the last possible home for that. And had that deal not been concluded, the creative team of Bull Durham likely would have had to move on, or at the very least it wouldn't have been a film starring Kevin Costner. For Roger Donaldson, this absolutely paved his way to more Hollywood productions, and the year after he would have another big hit with the Tom Cruise headlined Cocktail, and across the 90s he was regularly making Hollywood movies. The underrated one I'd suggest is the thriller White Sands that came out in 1992. The remake of The Getaway is a bit up and down. He did Cadillac Man, a very offbeat Robin Williams movie, and then he would get back into the murky world of political thrillers with Kevin Costner for 2000's 13 Days, made at New Line Cinema. A massively underrated movie that one is as well. But No Way Out was a real success story. That Orion was happy, Costner was happy, Donaldson was happy, and also I saw the film for the first time when it played over Christmas here in the UK. Just the BBC put it on one night, and apart from me being too young to watch the mucky bits, it was a case of I have no idea where this is going. Revisiting the film just ahead of this recording, it's very, very clever, just some of the clues that it lays in. But still, it is a film top to bottom that really, really holds up, with an ending that you just don't want to talk about anymore in case it spoils the ending. That's probably where I should sign off. If you like this podcast, there are a couple of ways. Well, there's 3 main ways you can support it outside of listening to it. You're listening to it. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. If you like it so much that you want to put some coins in the pot, then if you head over to patreon.com/SimonBrew, that's where you can sign up for our Patreon, and then you get the podcast early every week, pretty much every week. You also get it ad-free as well, and it just helps support the broader Film Stories project as well. Costing you absolutely nothing. nothing. Well, if you want to subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice, that's massively appreciated. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, things like that are absolute gold dust for independent podcasts such as this. I hugely appreciate everyone who's done that so far. Also, there's Film Stories print magazine. So issue 46 has just gone on sale. At the point this podcast has been recorded, it's the UK's biggest film magazine. 168 pages this issue. We've gone absolutely mad on it. We also have Film Junior magazine for under 15s, a print film magazine for under 15s. Imagine that. Well, it does exist. We've also had youngsters writing lots of the articles in the magazine as well. We're hugely proud of both of those. You can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. That's where you will find our new Blu-rays. The UK first Blu-ray release of No Way Out, which I've just been talking about, and also the UK's first Blu-ray release of the wonderful Bull Durham as well. And that brings to an end this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. One last plug, our 2 Blu-rays. I love physical media. I'm really chuffed we managed to put these Blu-rays together. The Blu-rays of No Way Out and Bull Durham, and also our previous Blu-ray of Sneakers, are all available on our online store, store.filmstories.co.uk. Then, if I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can find more from Film Stories at Film Stories. We're at youtube.com/Film Stories, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. The Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. And I've got news coming of another live show in London towards the end of November. If you keep an eye on the Film Stories website, we'll have more on that very shortly. You can find that at www.filmstories.co.uk. For now, I'm going to leave you in peace. I'm going to go and watch another load of films, most of them with Kevin Costner in, I'd imagine. Thank you for your time and thank you for listening. The most important thing, as always, is you all stay safe and well. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.